She grabbed his arm with a strength that shouldn't be possible for someone so frail, fingers digging into leather like she was drowning, and he was the only thing nearby. "Please," she whispered, "don't leave me here." He was a stranger, 6'3", covered in ink, the kind of man mothers pulled their children away from on the sidewalk. But something in her eyes stopped him cold. Not fear of him, but fear of something waiting behind her, in the house with the curtain that kept moving. He should have driven away like everyone else did. Instead, he crouched beside her and made a promise he didn't understand the cost of keeping. Travis Kessler had gotten used to the way people crossed the street when they saw him coming. It happened again that Tuesday morning outside the hardware store on Haywood Road, where a young mother pulled her son closer to her hip and steered him around the sidewalk like Travis was a pothole to avoid. He didn't blame her. 6'3", arms sleeved in faded ink from his army days, a grey beard that hadn't seen scissors in a year, and a leather vest with patches from a riding club most people in Asheville only knew from local news stories about noise complaints and bar fights. He looked exactly like what people expected a dangerous man to look like. It didn't matter that the worst thing he'd done in the last decade was let his motorcycle idle too long in a residential zone. He was 42 years old, and most of his life had narrowed down to small, quiet routines. Wake up in the apartment above what used to be his auto shop, make coffee, check on the shop equipment he still couldn't bring himself to sell, and ride. The shop had closed 2 years ago, not long after his wife Denise left, taking their unfinished marriage and most of the furniture with her. Travis didn't talk about that much. He didn't talk about much of anything these days, which was part of why people found him unsettling. Quiet men with big frames and tired eyes made people nervous, especially in a town that liked its eccentrics colorful and its intimidation kept to Halloween. He'd served 2 tours as a combat engineer, come home in one piece physically, and spent the years since learning that the harder wounds don't show up on X-rays. The bike helped. Something about the wind and the road noise quieted the parts of his brain that wouldn't shut off otherwise. He rode Tuesdays and Thursdays out toward the Blue Ridge Parkway, and Sundays he rode wherever the road took him, no destination, just motion. That particular Thursday, motion took him down Sweetbriar Lane, a stretch of modest houses on the edge of town where the sidewalks buckled from tree roots and half the streetlights didn't work. He almost didn't see her. She was sitting on the curb in front of a peeling blue house, a small woman in a cardigan 2 sizes too big, grey hair escaping from a bun, and when his headlight swept over her, he caught the dark bloom of a bruise along her jaw before she turned her face away. He slowed without deciding to. Some instinct from the army maybe, the one that noticed when something in a scene didn't add up. An elderly woman sitting on a curb at 9 in the morning, alone, was a scene that didn't add up. He pulled over onto the gravel shoulder and killed the engine. The silence that followed felt enormous. She hadn't moved, hadn't looked at him, but her shoulders had gone rigid, the posture of someone bracing for another blow. "Ma'am?" Travis kept his voice low, the way he might approach a stray dog. "You all right?" She flinched at the sound and finally turned. Up close, the bruise was worse than he'd first thought, a deep purple crescent along her cheekbone, and there was a raw scrape on her forearm that looked recent. Her eyes were pale blue and wet, and for a moment she simply stared at him, at the tattoos, the vest, the size of him, and Travis watched the calculation happen behind her eyes, the same one everyone made. Is this the kind of man who hurts people or helps them? "I'm fine," she said, in the automatic way people say it when they are anything but. "You don't look fine, ma'am, if you don't mind me saying." He crouched down, slow, non-threatening, keeping distance between them. "That's a nasty bruise. You need me to call somebody? Ambulance? Family?" Her chin trembled, and something in her face cracked open, the effort of holding herself together finally too much. "Please," she whispered. and her hand shot out, gripping his forearm with a strength that surprised him. "Please don't leave me here." Travis went still. He'd been in situations that called for quick decisions before, in places far more dangerous than a quiet street in Asheville, and something about the desperation in her grip told him this moment mattered more than it looked like it should. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "What's your name?" "Shirley," she said. "Shirley Whitfield." "I'm Travis Kessler. Can you tell me what happened, Shirley?" She glanced back toward the blue house, toward a window where a curtain had just shifted, and her whole body seemed to shrink. "I fell," she said too quickly, the lie sitting uneasily in her mouth. "I'm clumsy. I fall sometimes." Travis had heard that kind of lie before, from soldiers covering for each other, from men in bar fights who didn't want the cops involved. He recognized the shape of it, even coming from a 78-year-old woman on a curb. He didn't push, not yet. Pushing too hard, too fast, was how you lost people. "Okay," he said gently. "Well, clumsy or not, that scrape needs cleaning up before it gets infected. You got somebody who can look at it?" Shirley's eyes filled again, and this time a single tear slipped free before she could stop it. "There's nobody," she said. "There's nobody who checks." The words landed heavier than she probably meant them to. Travis looked at the house again, at the curtain that had gone still, and felt the old instinct rising in his chest, the one that had once told him where a wire was buried wrong, where a structure was about to fail. Something here was buried wrong. "All right, Shirley," he said, and he meant it as a promise even though he hadn't planned to make one. "I'm not leaving you here. Let's get you somewhere safe and we'll figure the rest out." He didn't know yet how far that promise would carry him, or how much it would cost. He only knew, crouched on that cracked sidewalk with a stranger's hand locked around his arm, that he wasn't going to be the kind of man who rode away. Getting Shirley to agree to see a doctor took 20 minutes of gentle persistence. Getting her to admit who lived in the blue house took considerably longer. Travis learned it in pieces, the way people tell the truth when they're ashamed of it. Her grandson, Curtis Whitfield, had moved in 8 months earlier after losing his apartment, promising to help with rent and groceries in exchange for a place to stay. Shirley's husband had passed 3 years before, and her only daughter lived out in Ohio, too far and too consumed with her own family to visit more than once a year. Curtis had seemed like a blessing at first. He fixed the leaky faucet, mowed the lawn, sat with her during the lonely evenings. Then the money started disappearing. Then the yelling started. Then 6 weeks ago, the first bruise. "He gets frustrated," Shirley said, staring at her hands as Travis drove her to the urgent care clinic in his truck, the one he kept for exactly these kinds of situations his bike couldn't handle. "He's not a bad boy, he's just going through a hard time." Travis kept his eyes on the road and his jaw tight. He'd heard that sentence before in a different context, from soldiers making excuses for commanding officers who crossed lines they shouldn't have crossed. The sentence never got easier to hear. "Shirley," he said carefully, "hard time or not, a grown man doesn't put his hands on his grandmother." She didn't answer that. She just looked out the window, and Travis let the silence sit, understanding that some truths take time to be spoken aloud, even to yourself. At the clinic, the nurse practitioner, a sharp-eyed woman named Diane Pruitt, took one look at the bruising pattern on Shirley's jaw and the fingerprint-shaped marks beginning to yellow on her upper arm, and her expression shifted from professional concern to something harder. She asked Shirley to step behind the curtain for an exam and asked Travis to wait outside, which he did, pacing the small waiting room like a man back in a war zone, scanning exits out of old habit. When Diane came out 20 minutes later, she found him standing by the window, arms crossed, looking exactly like the kind of man security guards kept an eye on. "You her son?" Diane asked, and the question carried its own suspicion. "No, ma'am. Found her on the curb this morning. She was scared to go home." Diane studied him a moment longer, and Travis watched her make the same calculation Shirley had made, appearance against instinct. Whatever she saw settled something in her because her shoulders relaxed slightly. "That's not a fall," she said quietly. "Those marks on her arm are consistent with being grabbed, hard, more than once. I'm required to report this to Adult Protective Services. I already called it in." "Good," Travis said. "What happens now?" "APS will investigate. It can take time, unfortunately. In the meantime, if she goes home to that same situation—" Diane didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Travis thought of Shirley's voice on the curb. "Please don't leave me here." He thought of the curtain shifting in the window, someone watching, someone waiting for the stranger to leave so things could go back to normal, back to whatever quiet cruelty had become normal in that house. "She's not going back there today," he said. "Not on my watch." He said it with more certainty than he felt qualified to have. He was a mechanic without a shop, a veteran without a unit, a man whose only real responsibility these days was making sure his rent got paid on time. But something about Shirley's fear had reached into him and found a part of himself he thought had gone dormant. The part that used to believe protecting people was simply what you did, no complicated reasoning required. When Shirley came out, moving slowly, a butterfly bandage on her scraped arm, she looked at Travis with an expression caught between gratitude and fresh worry. "I can't stay away," she said. "That's my house. My husband and I bought it in 1974. Where else would I go?" "You have anywhere? Friend, church, anybody?" She thought about it, and Travis watched hope flicker and then dim as she considered and discarded names. "There's Nancy Foster from my old bridge club, but I haven't spoken to her in months. Curtis didn't like me going out much." That detail told Travis more than Shirley probably realized. Isolation wasn't accidental. It was a tool, the same one Travis had seen used in worse places, cutting someone off from anyone who might notice or intervene. "All right," Travis said. "Let's call Nancy." Nancy Foster, when they reached her, sounded shocked to hear Shirley's voice, shocked further by what Travis explained in careful, measured terms, and finally, fiercely certain that Shirley would be staying with her that night, and as many nights as it took. Driving Shirley to Nancy's house across town, Travis caught her studying him in the passenger seat, an expression he couldn't quite read. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. "You don't know me. Most people look at you and cross the street, and here you are missing your whole day for a stranger." Travis kept his eyes on the road, feeling the old scar tissue of his own history pressing up against the moment. "Because somebody should have stopped for you a long time ago," he said, "and because I know what it's like to feel like nobody's watching." Shirley reached over and rested her weathered hand on his arm, the same grip from the curb, but softer now, less desperate. "Well," she said, "somebody's watching now." They arrived at Nancy's small brick ranch house just as the afternoon light was turning gold over the mountains, and Nancy came out to the driveway before the truck had even stopped, moving with the brisk urgency of a woman who had already rearranged her guest room twice that morning. She wrapped Shirley in a hug that lasted long enough to say everything words couldn't, and when she finally pulled back, her eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. "I should have called you months ago," Shirley said quietly, as Nancy fussed over her arm, over the bruise on her jaw, clicking her tongue at each new detail. "I didn't want you to see me like this." "Like what?" Nancy said, sharp enough that Travis nearly smiled despite the weight of the afternoon. "Like a woman who needs her friends. Shirley Whitfield, we've known each other 30 years. You think a little pride is going to keep me from helping you now?" Travis carried in the single suitcase Shirley had managed to pack, while Curtis was out earlier that morning, a handful of clothes and a framed photograph of Walter that she'd insisted on bringing, wrapped carefully in a towel, like something fragile enough to break twice over. He set it on the guest bed and stood in the doorway a moment, feeling suddenly like an intruder in a moment meant only for old friends. "I should get going," he said. "Let you two get settled." But Shirley caught his sleeve before he could leave. "Will you come back tomorrow, maybe? I don't have many people left who check on me, Travis, and I find I don't want to lose the one who finally did." He promised he would, and driving home that evening, Travis found himself replaying the day's events with a strange, unfamiliar feeling settling into his chest, something between purpose and worry. The sense that his quiet, solitary life had just acquired a thread connecting him to two people who needed him to keep showing up. Neither of them knew yet that Curtis would not let her go so easily. The first sign of trouble came 3 days later, in the form of a phone call Travis almost didn't answer. He'd fallen into a routine of checking on Shirley at Nancy Foster's house every afternoon, bringing groceries, sitting with her on the porch while she told him stories about her late husband Walter, a mailman who'd proposed to her on their third date and never once raised his voice in 41 years of marriage. Travis found himself looking forward to those afternoons more than he expected to, the quiet company filling a space in his week he hadn't realized was empty. The call came from a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, the way he did with most unknown callers, but something made him pick up. "You, the one taking my grandmother." The voice was young, aggressive, carrying the particular edge of someone used to getting his way through volume. Curtis Whitfield. Travis kept his own voice level, though his grip on the phone tightened. "Shirley's staying with a friend right now. That's her choice. That's my house she's avoiding. My grandmother. You got no right sticking your nose into family business. I don't know what she told you, some biker off the street, but you don't know the whole story. I know what a nurse practitioner documented. I know what APS is investigating. Seems like the whole story's coming out fine without my help." There was a pause, and when Curtis spoke again, his tone had shifted, oil smooth, wounded. "Look, man, I love my grandmother. I'm going through some things, lost my job, my girl left me, and yeah, maybe I've said some things I regret, but I've never hurt her. She's old, she bruises easy, she exaggerates things. You're going to ruin my life over a misunderstanding." Travis had heard this particular tune before, the abuser reframing himself as the victim, the situation as a misunderstanding rather than a pattern. He'd seen it in barracks, in bars, in the quiet corners of towns everywhere. It never failed to make his stomach turn. "I think you should talk to the caseworker assigned to the investigation," Travis said. "That's not a conversation for me." "You think you're some kind of hero, huh? Big tough biker saving the old lady. You don't even know her." "I've lived with her 8 months. I know things about her situation you don't." Curtis's voice climbed, frustration bleeding through the manufactured calm. "You're going to regret getting involved." The call ended abruptly, and Travis stood in his kitchen for a long moment, phone still in his hand, feeling something cold settle in his chest. He'd faced threats before, plenty of them, and this one, from an angry young man with a grudge, shouldn't have rattled him the way it did. But there was something about the specific menace in Curtis's tone, the promise buried in "you're going to regret," that stuck with him through the rest of the evening. That doubt deepened the next morning when Nancy Foster called, her voice tight with worry. Someone had slashed the tires on her car overnight, and she'd found a note tucked under the windshield wiper, unsigned, containing only the words, "Mind your own business." Travis drove over immediately, anger and guilt tangled together in his chest. Nancy, a woman well into her 70s who'd done nothing but offer a friend a place to stay, was now paying a price for kindness. Shirley sat on Nancy's porch swing, pale and shaking, blaming herself in the particular way that victims often do. "This is my fault," she said. "I never should have involved you both. I should just go home, apologize to Curtis, let things go back to normal." "Normal was you bruised on a curb," Travis said, more sharply than he intended, and immediately softened his tone. "I'm sorry, but Shirley, normal wasn't safe. This isn't your fault. None of this is your fault." "But it's escalating," Nancy said, wringing her hands. "What if he comes here? What if he hurts Shirley worse or hurts one of us?" Travis felt the old weight of responsibility pressing down on him, the same weight he'd carried overseas when a decision he made could mean someone's safety or someone's harm. He had no official standing here. He wasn't law enforcement, wasn't a social worker, wasn't family. He was just a man who'd stopped his motorcycle on a whim of instinct. And now 3 women, Shirley, Nancy, and in some sense himself, were tangled in a situation with real danger attached. For the first time since that Thursday morning on Sweetbriar Lane, Travis felt the pull of doubt. Maybe he'd overstepped. Maybe the tangled bureaucracy of protective services would have handled it eventually, slower but safer, without painting a target on an elderly woman's only friend. Maybe the town's judgment of him wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe he really was the kind of man who brought trouble wherever he went, even when he meant well. He sat with that doubt through a sleepless night, staring at the ceiling of his apartment above the shuttered shop, listening to the occasional passing car and wondering if Curtis was out there in the dark, watching, waiting. But by morning, doubt had hardened into something more useful. He thought of Shirley's grip on his arm, the desperation in her voice. Please don't leave me here. He thought of what it would mean to walk away now, to let intimidation win, to prove every frightened glance he'd ever received on the street correct after all. He called the detective handling the case, a woman named Ruth Bannister with the Asheville Police Department's Elder Abuse Unit, and reported the vandalism and the threat. Then he called the club, the Riding brothers most people crossed the street to avoid, and asked for help keeping watch. Wesley Holt was the first to answer, a broad-shouldered former truck driver who'd ridden with Travis for nearly a decade, and he didn't ask a single question beyond what time to show up. Owen Marsh, quieter, more deliberate, offered to take the overnight shift outside Nancy's house without being asked twice. Neither man knew Shirley Whitfield from any other stranger on the street, but that had never mattered in the club. You showed up when a brother called, and you didn't need the whole story to understand that somebody's grandmother was in danger, and somebody's grandson had chosen fear over decency. That evening, Travis sat with Shirley on Nancy's porch, watching Owen's motorcycle idle quietly at the curb, headlight off, a silent sentinel against the coming dark. Shirley watched him too, studying the scene with an expression Travis couldn't quite place. "They're doing this for me," she said. "Men who've never even met me." "That's what family looks like sometimes," Travis said. "Not always blood. Sometimes it's just people who decide to show up." Shirley was quiet for a long moment, turning that thought over. "Walter used to say something similar. He said the people who love you aren't always the ones who share your name. Sometimes they're the ones who share your trouble." She smiled faintly, the first real smile Travis had seen from her since the curb. "I think he would have liked you, Travis Kessler. He didn't care much for appearances either." The compliment settled somewhere deep in Travis's chest, a small warmth against the cold uncertainty of the days ahead. He thought of his own father, a man who'd measured worth by handshakes and haircuts, who would have crossed the street himself if he'd passed Travis on a random sidewalk without knowing his own son beneath the ink and leather. The thought used to sting. Tonight, sitting beside a woman who had decided to trust him completely, it stung a little less. If Curtis wanted a fight over who would protect Shirley Whitfield, Travis intended to make sure he lost it. Word spread through Asheville the way it does in smaller cities, half rumor and half truth, tangled together until nobody could quite separate the strands. By the end of that week, the story circulating wasn't about an elderly woman suffering quiet abuse. It was about a motorcycle gang intimidating a young man, about bikers camped outside a house on a quiet residential street, about exactly the kind of trouble people expected from men who looked like Travis. He felt the shift immediately. The hardware store clerk, who used to nod politely, now watched him with open suspicion. A neighbor, 2 doors down from Nancy's house, called the police to report loitering, describing Travis and 2 of his riding brothers, Wesley Holt and Owen Marsh, sitting on their bikes across the street, simply keeping watch as promised. The responding officer, new to the department and unfamiliar with the actual case file, nearly cited them before Detective Ruth Bannister intervened, having to explain patiently that the men in leather vests were the ones protecting the victim, not threatening her. "You understand how this looks," Ruth said to Travis afterward, not unkindly, as they stood on the sidewalk while the confused officer drove off. "Big men on motorcycles outside an old woman's house. People see what they expect to see." "I know how it looks," Travis said. "Doesn't change what's true." Ruth studied him for a long moment, the same appraising look Diane the nurse had given him days earlier. "For what it's worth, the investigation's moving faster than usual. Financial records show Curtis withdrew almost $11,000 from Shirley's savings account over 6 months, transactions she never authorized. Combined with the medical documentation, we've got enough for an emergency protective order and likely criminal charges. But he's not going down without trying to twist this into something it isn't." That twisting came to a head 3 days later, on a grey Saturday afternoon, when the sky over the Blue Ridge hung low and heavy with an approaching storm. Curtis showed up at Nancy's house himself, red-faced, unannounced, pounding on the door while Shirley froze in the living room and Nancy fumbled for her phone. Travis had been on the porch, having just arrived for his afternoon visit, and he stepped between Curtis and the door before the younger man's fist could connect a second time. "She doesn't want to see you right now," Travis said, keeping his voice level, despite the adrenaline flooding his system, old training taking over, cataloging exits, distances, the tension in Curtis's shoulders that suggested he might do something reckless. "This isn't your family," Curtis snarled, jabbing a finger toward Travis's chest without quite touching him. "You don't get to decide who she talks to. You've turned her against me, you and your whole ugly little gang. And for what? To feel like some kind of protector. You're a washed-up mechanic playing hero because your own life fell apart." The words landed harder than Travis expected, striking close to a truth he'd never said aloud to anyone. But he held his ground, remembering Shirley's face on that curb, the fear in her eyes when the curtain shifted in the window. "Maybe you're right about my life," Travis said quietly, "but that's not what this is about. This is about $11,000 missing from her account and bruises that don't come from being clumsy. That's not my imagination, Curtis. That's a police investigation." Something in Curtis's expression cracked, the bravado slipping to reveal something more frightened and more dangerous underneath. "She was going to help me," he said, voice rising. "I needed that money. I was drowning, and she's got more than she needs sitting there in that account doing nothing. And when I asked her not to tell anybody, she just wouldn't listen. She kept threatening to call my mother, and I just needed her to stop pushing." He stopped himself, hearing his own words hang in the air, the closest thing to a confession he was likely to give without a lawyer present. Behind Travis, the front door opened, and Shirley stepped out onto the porch despite Nancy's protest, her small frame steadier than Travis had seen it since that morning on the curb. "You pushed me into the counter," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Twice. And when I fell, you told me it was my fault for getting in your way. I loved you since you were born, Curtis. I loved you enough to lie for you. I'm done lying." The rawness of it seemed to hollow Curtis out entirely. He looked between his grandmother and Travis, and whatever plan had brought him to that porch dissolved into something smaller and more pathetic. A young man cornered by his own choices, with nowhere left to hide them. That was the moment the patrol car pulled up, Detective Bannister behind the wheel, responding to Nancy's call. Curtis didn't resist when the responding officers approached him, didn't argue, seemed almost relieved to have the confrontation taken out of his hands. As they led him to the car, he glanced back once at Shirley, And whatever passed between them in that look, regret or resentment or simply exhaustion, Travis couldn't say for certain. He only knew that Shirley didn't look away this time. She stood on the porch, small and bruised but unbending, and watched until the patrol car disappeared around the corner. "It's over," Nancy said softly, wrapping an arm around Shirley's shoulders. Travis wasn't sure it was over, not entirely, not with courts and hearings and the slow, grinding process of justice still ahead. But something essential had shifted. Shirley had spoken her truth out loud, in front of witnesses, in front of the man who'd hurt her, and that alone felt like the turning of a very heavy door on a very old hinge. The rain that had threatened all afternoon finally broke as the patrol car pulled away, fat drops darkening the porch steps, and Nancy hurried Shirley inside with the practiced fuss of someone grateful to have something ordinary to focus on after so much fear. Travis lingered on the porch a moment longer, letting the rain soak through his vest, needing the cold shock of it to settle the adrenaline still humming through his chest. Detective Bannister approached him before leaving, her expression softer than the professional mask she'd worn through most of the investigation. "You did good today," she said. "Most people would have called it in and stayed out of the way. You didn't have to put yourself between them." "Wasn't going to let him hit her again," Travis said simply. "No," Bannister agreed. "I don't imagine you were." She studied him a moment, the same look he'd gotten from Diane weeks earlier, the recalibration of a first impression against the evidence of actions. "For what it's worth, Kessler, this town's got a funny way of deciding who the dangerous ones are. Might be they've got it backward more often than they'd like to admit." Travis didn't have an answer for that, not one he trusted himself to say without his voice catching, so he simply nodded and watched her walk back to her cruiser. When he finally stepped inside Nancy's house, dripping rainwater onto the entryway rug, Shirley was sitting at the kitchen table, wrapped in a blanket, hands cupped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, staring at nothing in particular. "I keep waiting to feel relieved," she admitted when he sat down across from her. "Instead, I just feel tired. Tired all the way through, like I've been holding my breath for 8 months and I don't know how to stop." "That's all right," Travis said. "Relief comes later, usually. Right now you just get to rest." She looked up at him, her pale blue eyes steadier than they'd been that first morning on the curb, though still shadowed with everything the day had cost her. "Thank you for not leaving," she said. "Not that morning. Not any morning since." "I told you I wouldn't," Travis said. "I meant it." Outside, the rain kept falling against the windows, washing the dust off Sweetbriar Lane, and for the first time in months, Shirley Whitfield slept that night without flinching at every sound the old house made settling around her. 3 months later, the blue house on Sweetbriar Lane had a fresh coat of paint, a pale, cheerful yellow that Shirley had chosen herself from a hardware store swatch card, standing in the same aisle where strangers used to avoid Travis's path. Curtis had accepted a plea agreement, a mix of restitution and probation and mandatory counseling that the courts determined more useful than prison for a young man whose crimes, while serious, had grown from desperation rather than calculated cruelty. Shirley had testified at the sentencing hearing, her voice steady in a way that surprised even herself, describing not just the bruises, but the slow erosion of feeling safe in her own home, the particular grief of being harmed by someone she'd hoped to help. Travis had shown up to every hearing, sitting in the back row in his leather vest, drawing stares from other spectators who couldn't quite reconcile his appearance with his purpose. He'd stopped explaining himself to strangers somewhere around the second hearing, let them wonder. The people who mattered, Shirley, Nancy, Detective Bannister, Diane at the clinic, had long since stopped seeing the tattoos and the beard and started seeing the man underneath, the one who kept his promises even when keeping them cost him sleep and comfort, and, for one tense afternoon, very nearly his safety. He'd started fixing up the old shop again, slowly, weekends mostly, no clear plan for reopening, but finding comfort in the familiar work of restoring something broken. Shirley visited sometimes, bringing him sandwiches on days when his hands were too greasy to make his own lunch, sitting on an overturned crate and telling him more stories about Walter, about the mailman who never raised his voice, about the 41 years of ordinary happiness she'd once thought she'd never speak of again without grief overwhelming her. "You know," she said one afternoon in early autumn, watching him rebuild a carburetor with the same patience he'd shown her on that curb months before, "when you stopped that morning, I thought you were going to hurt me. I want you to know that. I looked at you, and I was afraid." Travis didn't look up from his work, but he nodded. "I know. Most people do, at first. That's the thing I can't stop thinking about," Shirley continued. "This whole town, they'll cross the street from a man like you, but they'd have walked right past me on that curb without stopping at all. Nobody else did stop, Travis. Cars went by that morning before you came along. Nobody else even slowed down." He set the wrench down and finally met her eyes. Maybe they didn't see what needed seeing. Or maybe they saw it and told themselves somebody else would handle it. "But you didn't tell yourself that." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." The truth of it sat between them, simple and unadorned. Travis had spent years believing his appearance defined how the world would treat him, and in some ways it still did. But somewhere along the way, in the space of one frightened woman's grip on his arm, he'd remembered something he'd forgotten he still believed, that the choice to help wasn't about how you looked crossing a street, but about whether you were willing to stop when it mattered. Nancy Foster had become a fixture in both their lives, and the three of them had settled into an easy rhythm. Sunday dinners at Shirley's newly painted house, Travis bringing his riding brothers along sometimes, watching Wesley Holt, a giant of a man with a soft spot for pie, patiently teach Shirley how to play poker, while Nancy scolded them both for gambling with grocery money. The bikers, who had once made Nancy's neighbor call the police in suspicion, now waved to that same neighbor from Shirley's porch, and slowly the waves started getting returned. Word of what had happened on Sweetbriar Lane spread through Asheville eventually, the true version this time, carried by Detective Bannister's report and Diane's testimony, and Nancy's grateful retelling to anyone who would listen. The town's judgment didn't disappear entirely. Prejudice rarely does. But something shifted in the quiet corners of conversation, a grudging acknowledgement that the man everyone had been taught to fear was the only one who'd actually stopped. Travis still rode Sweetbriar Lane sometimes, out of habit more than necessity now, past the yellow house with its tended garden and its porch light that Shirley kept burning every evening, a small beacon against the dark. He no longer needed to check on her the way he once had. The danger had passed, the courts had done their work, and Shirley Whitfield had reclaimed her home and her voice both. But he rode past anyway because some promises don't have an expiration date, and because he'd learned that the people who stay, who keep showing up long after the crisis fades, are the ones who make a promise mean something. On the anniversary of that first morning, Shirley invited him to dinner, and over dessert she took his rough, ink-covered hand in her small, weathered one. "You saved my life," she said simply, "not just from Curtis, from believing nobody would ever stop for me again." Travis thought of all the years he'd spent believing the reverse, that his appearance meant people were right to look away from him, that the judgment written on strangers' faces was a verdict he deserved. Sitting at Shirley's table, in the warm, yellow light of a home he'd helped make safe again, he finally let that old belief go. "You saved something in me too," he said. "I just didn't know it needed saving until I stopped." Outside, his motorcycle waited in the driveway, engine cooling in the autumn evening, ready for wherever the road would take him next. But for tonight, he was exactly where he needed to be, proof enough that the most feared can be the most faithful, and that the truest strength sometimes looks like nothing more than a man who simply refuses to leave. Later that night, Riding home along the dark curve of Sweetbriar Lane with the porch light glowing gold in his mirror, Travis thought about all the versions of himself the town had decided existed before ever speaking to him. The dangerous drifter, the washed-up mechanic, the intimidating stranger best avoided on a quiet sidewalk. None of those versions had ever accounted for a man who simply couldn't drive past a woman crying on a curb, who couldn't shake the old soldier's instinct that noticing when something was wrong came with an obligation to act. He thought too about Denise, about the marriage that had crumbled under the weight of his silences, the years he'd spent believing he had nothing left worth offering anyone. Shirley Whitfield, in her fear and her stubborn dignity, had handed him back something he thought he'd lost for good. The certainty that his presence could mean safety instead of suspicion, that the size of his hands and the ink on his arms didn't have to be the only story people saw. The following spring, Shirley planted tulips along the front walk of the Yellow House, working the soil herself, despite Nancy's protests that she should let the younger folks handle the digging. Travis stopped by most weekends to help anyway, kneeling in the dirt beside a woman who'd taught him, without ever meaning to, that courage sometimes looked like an old woman refusing to disappear quietly, and that redemption sometimes looked like a stranger who simply decided to stay. When people in town asked Travis about the story now, the version that had finally replaced the rumors, he kept his answer short. He hadn't done anything heroic, he told them. He'd only done what anyone should have done from the start. But every evening, riding past the Yellow House and its steady porch light, some small, quiet part of him understood that he had done more than that. He had proven to a town quick to judge and slow to look closer that the ones who look the most frightening are sometimes simply the ones who've learned, the hard way, exactly how much a single act of staying can matter.